Well, I mean, I'm delighted. I'm really thrilled to be joined by, let me get this right because it's quite a list, director, producer, screenwriter, cinematographer, and now novelist, Andrew Davis. Hello, Andrew Davis.
And father and grandfather and
A
husband.
father and grandfather. Even better. How do we find you? Are you well?
I'm very well. We just had this Thanksgiving event, which was great, just having all the family here, and so
Lovely.
great. I'm very depressed about the election, but that's a whole other issue.
There's nothing I can do about that, sadly. My
Oh, I
limited
don't know. The
superpowers.
Brexit had something to do with something. I don't
You
know.
can't pin that on me, Andrew Davis. It's just like that one's not mine. But yes, there's a whole political conversation we could get and just make ourselves both cry, I think. Um, in brighter news, you've just published your first novel, which,
Which will begin our political conversation, I think.
well,
Anyway,
absolutely. I mean, it's
yeah.
bursting with politics, isn't it? Prescient politics. I'm really careful of being spoiler light on things like this, but I
No,
don't think there's
I don't
much.
mind. You know what? The novel is so complex in a wonderful, interesting way
Yeah.
that I don't mind throwing these things out because it'll entice people to maybe read it, which is asking a lot.
Okay, so the novel's called, let's start there. The novel's called Disturbing the Bones. Tell me what you're comfortable people knowing about your novel, just plot wise. If you can set that up and then I can be led by you.
Wow.
All the
Well,
pressure's on you now.
let's start with how it came to be. How's
Yep.
that?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm trying to think of the order of things, but years ago I did a movie with Tommy Lee Jones and Gene Hackman called The
The
Package.
package, of course.
Which was a sort of under the radar political thriller made in
Yep.
1980, 86 or something like that. Anyway, and it was a story about détente. It was the Soviet Russian military and the American military were about to sign a disarmament peace agreement.
Yeah.
And this is the time of Bush and Gorbachev. And the premise was that the generals were not going to let this happen, and they were going to try to kill Gorbachev. And so John Bishop, a playwright from New York who had been a Marine, wrote this story. And the package refers to a prisoner who's being escorted. That was the assassin. That was
Yep.
Tommy Lee. Hackman was the guy bringing him over, and Joanna Cassidy was Hackman's ex-wife who was involved. Okay, and John Hurd was the bad guy. Anyway, it was a really good thriller. And matter of fact, they
There
just
are.
showed it at the Chicago Film Festival because it's very relevant to this novel. Because the novel's about, in the broad strokes, a terrible political event that occurs because of an accident. A Russian missile goes awry and kills several 100,000 people in Siberian Mongolia one day.
Yep.
A new president, an African American woman, believe it or not, is elected and calls for a peace conference in Chicago where the atom was split. As a matter of fact, yesterday was the anniversary of the splitting of the atom by Enrico Fermi at the University of Chicago. The nuclear age started 80 some years ago today, right? So with that in mind, I thought, this is a very interesting political dynamic between the strongest militaries of the world saying, we're not giving up our weapons.
Yeah.
Okay. And then years later, a friend of mine, a mentor of mine, was working for the state of Illinois in the Department of Transportation. And he told me about this archaeological dig in southern Illinois,
Yeah.
where the rivers and the flooding had covered up 26 layers going back 13,000 years in one campsite. And this is the mounds area of Middle America, with the most significant archaeological, anthropological area of America,
Yeah.
where all this history is preserved. And I thought, that's interesting. Someone's digging in the ground and they find something mysterious, right?
Yeah.
And I also thought the metaphor, going back to the package, was what are we going to be remembered for? Where are we going to be? We're going to be remembered for our missile silos. That's the things that are going to last forever. And so when we blow each other up and there's nothing left and they come down from, Musk sends people down from Mars or something, he'll be able to find out that these silos are in the ground, and that's what we left of our culture.
There
And then
was.
there's a third element, which is Illinois is a very long state, so almost 400 miles long.
Yeah.
And at the tip is the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi River, which is called Little Egypt, Cairo, like the confluence in the Middle East. and it's infamous. It's where Ulysses Grant led the war, Civil War. His headquarters were there, and in the 60s, black people who lived in this town couldn't get jobs. They couldn't go to the store. It was like the Deep South, and they protested, and the Klan rose up, and Nazis came down from Chicago, and John Lewis was there, Jesse Jackson, a very famous civil rights place.
Hmm.
So we blended. I blended initially as a screenplay the story of a young archaeologist who discovers a body in the ground
Yeah.
that's not amongst all of her Indian artifacts.
So was this Groundburst? Was this the film you were going to make in the early 90s?
Sort of.
Yeah.
But it's changed, and then but the elements are similar,
Yeah.
and so now it's just, the story has evolved into this discovery of a body that belongs to the son who has lost his mother when he was 14. He's a cop in Chicago,
Yeah.
an African American cop. So it's a story about a cop who has to go down years later, after not knowing whatever happened to his mother, and discover the backstory. And the three main characters are the cop, the young archaeologist, and the man who's building the highway, who's a master bunker builder, who built the bunkers in Saudi Arabia, who's got the contract on the road that the archaeologist is under contract to. And those are the three main characters.
So how does your brain work then? Because those ingredients have been about in your head for a period of time. And I mean, look, researching you over the last week or two, I saw this early film idea, Groundburst, come up. And so I'm thinking that at least threads of this have been around for like 10, 20 years for you.
Maybe maybe longer.
So how do you decide how to tell that story? Why did it become a book?
Well, it started as a screenplay.
Yeah,
And then I found this wonderful writer, Jeff Biggers, to work with on the screenplay. And we did all this research. I had all this research from the past, and he had research in the present. And uh, we decided that there was so much going on. There was such rich texture and characters that it would be better to develop it as a book and then come back to the screenplay. So that's where we are now. We wrote the book, and somebody liked it enough to publish it,
yeah.
and it's got rave reviews and comments. And so now we have to figure out how to turn the screenplay back into what the novel has offered, and figure out how to get it financed, which is no small feat.
No, I'm hearing that quite a lot at the moment. So you can't tell me the ending because I'm not quite at the end of the book, but I'm very, very deep into it now, which is partly why I'm trying to protect myself from spoilers. Um,
Okay.
I mean, the storyteller instinct in you just seems to run rich through this, that you're blending a lot of contemporary themes in there as well that have run through your films too. I mean, again, relatively spoiler light, but there's a big business overtone to The Fugitive. For instance, if we go right the way through your movies, there's kind of like just almost this Trojan horse element to them. And then I read that early in your career, one of the things that helped get it off the ground was you fighting the union, really, just to try and get access, a willingness to kind of stand up against power to some degree. Are these the core themes that are really important to you?
Well, it's interesting because my parents are old lefties, so they
Right. Okay.
always supported unions, and I've been in about seven unions myself over the years. But I was trying to be a young cinematographer. I was a protege of Haskell Wexler's,
Of course.
and I studied Gordon Willis and all the great European cameramen, and Storaro and everything, and but I couldn't get in the union. They wanted us, all the young cameramen who had done non-union pictures for Corman, couldn't get a job with the studios because the directors moved on, but we couldn't. So I started a lawsuit with Caleb Deschanel, Tak Fujimoto, Alan Davio, all these great young cinematographers, and it took a long time, but it was called Davis et al. Versus IATSE et al. Because we
Yeah.
sued the studios and the union because they were not letting people onto the roster, the seniority roster, fairly. Anyway, in the course of doing that, I said, Scorsese did Mean Streets and Lucas did graffiti.
Yeah.
and I'll do a film about my brother growing up, about a kid in Chicago becoming a musician. So that was the transition from being cinematographer to director.
And that
Okay.
was Stony Island.
Was Stony Island, the first film, and that was a film that sort of established a certain style, I think, about both the look of Chicago and how to use Chicago as a location, and
Yeah.
also a theme about race and racism, and that was a very positive movie about kids making music and getting along, from different backgrounds. But I was a journalism major, and in the 60s when I was on WILL TV in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois, where Roger Ebert was the editor of the Daily Illini, later become the most famous critic in
Yeah.
America. Um, you know, I was handed AP and UPI wire service reports about Vietnam, and they were lies. And I didn't want to be continuing the lies that were handed to me. I said, I'll get involved in storytelling as a photographer and as a cinematographer, and images were what worked for me mostly. I was not a big writer or reader. So over the course of becoming a director, I've learned to take ideas that are on the page and work with them and manipulate them. I mean, for example, the package was never set in Chicago, it was set in Camp David. And it had to be opened up. It had to become visual. It had to use the city, and have a peace conference going on.
Yeah. I mean,
So anyway, so that's sort of how the idea. Now that the novels come out, there's a lot of conversation about this continuing theme of the social message within these action films, within these thrillers, within
yeah, yeah.
these holes. They all have something to say about something, which I think is good. It's better to come out of a movie learning something or having a point of view presented to you and still be entertained than just watching people beat each other up.
There are lots of people who seem to gravitate towards people just beating each other up. So they say they seem to be the movies in vogue at the moment. I've noticed. I hear your point loud and clear. You dropped in another key element to a lot of your storytelling there, which is Chicago and just geography, giving things a sense of place. You've done it again with the novel, and you're exploring bits of Chicago and the surrounding area in the novel. And also, you strike me for all the successes that you've had as a man who never really did Hollywood, even though you did these big, huge Hollywood films. It's like Chicago always seems to have been an absolutely pivotal part of your working life.
Well, Hollywood became a hiring mall.
Yeah,
Crews were there, and if you needed special kind of equipment or location, like in a studio with tanks and things like that, there were things that were there. But I always preferred to shoot on location. And, like when we did The Guardian, we built a huge water tank in Louisiana.
yes, I've just been reading
So,
that oddly.
so I moved out of Hollywood when I started our family, and we moved to Santa Barbara.
Yeah,
And there are a few directors who do live in Santa Barbara, and actors and producers, but it's not that far from LA, and LA would be used for dubbing and labs if necessary. So, but Chicago has become it's a great back lot. I mean, it's a great crews and terrific talent pool and cooperation and architecture. I mean, after we did The Fugitive, everybody started going there. They did Batman
I was
there,
going to say, yeah.
they did Paul Newman did a gangster movie there, and a lot of films that were shot in Chicago. Um, and I feel proud that those early films, starting with Stony Island, because Stony Island, Mayor Daley's funeral was in the movie,
Yeah.
you know, because I wanted to shoot the St. Patrick's Day parade, which I did in The Fugitive. But so Daley's funeral's in there, and then after that, because he wouldn't allow a gun in any movie because of the Al Capone mystique of Chicago. Daley would not allow a movie to be shot in Chicago that used a gun.
Good grief. Explain to people who don't know who Daly is for us.
Mayor King Daley, King
Yeah.
Richard
Yeah.
Daley, whose son became the next King Daley.
Yeah.
Right. Richard Daley ruled Chicago, I don't know, 30 years. He was the old Irish boss. Probably helped the IRA very much out of Chicago. So anyway, he was the guy who controlled things, and then it opened up after he passed.
So, I mean, you went from Stony Island and you went into, I mean, you worked with Joe Roth straight after that, I believe, was it The Final Terror. And I think that was the title it ended up with. I remember it. I mean, it went through about three, four different names. I think I've got Campsite Massacre, Three Blind Mice, Bump in the Night.
Wow, you do your
The
research.
Forest Primeval, I think it was called. I don't even know what that means. Um, but there was this. I find turning points in careers really interesting, and just like the small pinch points. And there was a point where that film was sat on the shelf, as I understand it, for about 2 years, while people played with the title and couldn't work out what to do with it. I'm just curious, where are you in the middle of all of that? Because you've made Stony Island, you've got this particular project, and now presumably you're just waiting.
Well, Stony Island got great reviews.
Yeah, and it's
With,
worth noting it's just been screening again just fairly recently. It's
yeah, no, it terrific reviews, and it's sort of looked at as a kind of timepiece
yeah,
of Chicago and music and that whole scene. Um, I think what happened was we did it was I found Final Terror, and the cinematographer is Andreas Davidescu, which is my Romanian name, and
is that right?
and yeah, and and I met Joe Pantoliano, who
Yeah.
later was in two other big movies of mine, and Daryl Hannah was somebody who was Haskell's niece who was in it, and Rachel Ward was someone whose picture I saw at an agent's desk and said, "Who's this beautiful woman?" And anyway, um, I wound up. I think Joe Roth wanted to do something with it. He wanted to put another scare at the beginning of the movie. And I had been invited to Deauville with Stony Island. I was the young director now, right?
Right.
And so I was invited to Deauville, and he wound up shooting an opening, which I didn't think was very well done. It's about, I don't know, a minute or two opening. And the editor cut it together and shot it. And I sued Joe Roth because he didn't have the right to do that under the Directors Guild, and he gave me $5,000 that paid for my wedding. So
So I mean
that's how I
it,
went. So I went from doing a musical to doing a horror film, and then I wound up getting hired by Harry Belafonte to do Beat Street because because he saw Stony Island and loved it, and they were doing a breakdance movie, and they hired me to write and direct a breakdance movie, and that was another. This is how I became an action director. Um, we were 15 days into a 30-day schedule, and Harry had been on tour
yeah.
and there's no music ready. And the guy he hired to do the music wanted all the publishing, and he had no idea of schedules and timing. And so Harry didn't admit to the studio that he hadn't paid attention to the music. He said, well, we think we should get another director. Well, Mike Medavoy at Orion saw the footage and said, this is terrific footage.
Yeah.
I know him. I love Stony Island. I'm going to offer him Code of Silence. And so I fell out
Chuck
of a
Norris.
window.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so I fell out of the window with my young baby in New York being fired. And then I became an action director.
Because Medavoy writes in his memoir about when he picked you up for Orion, you'd been fired from two films.
Right.
I don't know if that's accurate. I presume The Running Man was one of them, but Beat
There's
Street,
another one where Schwartz, I was the fourth director hired.
yeah, I mean that was just a conveyor
And
belt.
the producers were doing something very illicit with the money, and I don't know what was going on. But anyway, and they had to pay me off. It was one of those things. It was into a schedule, and they kept saying, "You just worry about directing the movie. We'll take care of everything else." Well, Adidas was supposed to deliver the clothes. There were no clothes ready, and Arnold had nothing to wear. And it was doing this ice skating sequence. All my stuff is in the movie,
Yeah,
you know, usually for the trailer. So from there, I wound up. I don't know what I did next. I did Above the Law or something like this. I did Above the Law, I think, or Code of
yeah.
Silence.
But I mean, going back to you sued Joe Roth on what your second
I
film
didn't
as
sue him. The
direct.
Directors Guild said you're not allowed to shoot something without offering it to the original director, and so
Right,
they
okay.
said
I was going to say that that's some brass. I mean, fairly
oh,
in your career.
we'd had the lawsuit with the union, so I mean,
Yeah, I'm not
anyhow.
knocking it. It's just like most people that early in their career, they just take it.
Well, the
You
thing,
just don't.
Haskell had to sue the union to get in.
Yeah,
There were precedents.
yeah,
There are other lawsuits, and in those days, they were interested in young talent. They were interested in making sure young talent got a voice. Scorsese and Coppola and Lucas were just coming into their own.
yeah,
I don't know if they opened their doors a little bit more. So when we had the lawsuit with the union, it opened the door not just to cinematographers, but everybody,
yeah.
editors, production designers, all kinds of different crafts got in the union.
I mean, Mike Medavoy's book about his time at Orion, I just find a fascinating read. And he talks in there about I'm quoting him here, we probably started or furthered more interesting careers than any other studio in the 80s. And he's listing your name alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger, Susan Sarandon, Paul Verhoeven, Sean Penn, Madonna, Jodie Foster, Oliver Stone. Again, going back to that idea of turning points, because at the point where you've been fired off a movie, a movie or two, I mean, there was a danger,
Best thing that
presumably.
ever happened. I got to buy a house in
You
Santa
could have paid for
Barbara.
your way.
It paid for my wedding. No, I didn't get fired by Joe Roth, but anyway,
No, I get that.
a lot of time, there are turning points, and I think the critical part is having mentors, having people who believe in you.
Yeah,
The fact that Haskell Wexler sort of took me under his wing, and here's a guy won Academy Awards. He was from a wealthy family. He was very secure. He was friendly with all the big actors and directors and stars and everything. And so the fact that he gave me my blessings, he saw something in my commercial reel that I'd done as a cinematographer in Chicago
yeah,
and recommended me to Hal Ashby. That's great. And then Medavoy, who basically, he had something, a bone to pick with David Picker. And when he saw the fact that they had fired me and there was nothing wrong with the footage, he said, I'm going to show this guy that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then Code of Silence became a big hit for Orion.
yeah. You dropped Hal Ashby's name in there. I got that had it not been for the union, you would have ended up shooting Harold and Maude. Is there
Well,
truth
I
to
would
that?
have worked. Yeah, I would have done something. I wouldn't have been the cinematographer. John Alonzo was the
Of course,
cinematographer.
yeah, yeah,
Haskell recommended. It was interesting. Alonzo recommended me to Menachem Golan to shoot my first big feature, Lepke, with Tony
yeah.
Curtis in Panavision for Warner Brothers. So that it's all connected. People who recommend young talent. In those days, when we did Stony Island, which I finally did as I got in the union as a cameraman at the same time,
Yeah.
there were 6 or 7 independent movies made in America. That's it. Now you've got 60,000 films being loaded to YouTube every day.
But also the era of the 80s is you had a company. I think the middle ground has come out of films enormously, and you had companies for better or worse like the Orions, the Hemdales, who would take a gamble on filmmakers and films that didn't have massive budgets but weren't micro ones either. And
Right.
I just think that that whole era of Orion and what Mike Medavoy was saying feels a bit more, I mean, almost endangered species there.
Well, the cost of making films has gone up, number
Yeah,
one. The cost of distribution is ridiculous.
yeah,
Okay. And so the chances of making a movie where you get your money back is rare. Now, Orion had deals with studios to distribute their films.
yeah.
They were going to get them out there, and they were going to be able to control the advertising and the marketing and all that kind of stuff. But today, you're an independent company. There's a handful, I guess, of independent distributors now.
Yeah.
But I don't know how they collect and how it works with selling the rights off to streaming and videos and 2 cents on this movie and 2 cents on that movie. It's very tough. It's very difficult.
You mentioned you took a job basically, which was 1988's Above the Law, I think it was, which was your first film with Steven Seagal. I found a note on that though in the Los Angeles Times going back to spring 1987, where it said that it wasn't that you were outright hired. It's Warner Brothers spent $50,000, it says, for you to film a number of scenes from the screenplay as a screen test. Was that accurate? Is that an accurate report, or was it a straight you got the job?
Well, I don't know. What happened was Seagal. Warner's had a project called Out, and it
Right.
was a story about TVs being stolen off the docks of San Francisco. And they were interested. Code of Silence was considered a hit, and they wanted me to direct this movie. And I said, well, John Boy would be good in the movie, and mention some names. And they said, well, we want you to meet this guy named Steven Seagal. I said, who's Steven Seagal? Well, just meet him. And so I met him, and he said, I picked you. I saw Code of Silence, and I picked you to direct my first movie. I said, really? He says, Michael Ovitz is my agent, and he's got Warner Brothers to put up the money so I can be in a movie. I'm his martial arts Aikido instructor,
Yeah.
and he thinks he can make a star out of me. And I said to Steven, I said, well, I don't know if you can act. We have to do a test. He said, what do you mean? All these other directors are ready to go tomorrow. I said, well, I think we got to do a test, Steven. And so I got Warner Brothers to send me back to Chicago. And I used a bunch of the guys in Code of Silence, and we did a screen test. It's a wonderful test. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
It's he in a car with a real cop, Joe Casala, and they're talking about stuff. And then he's with his wife, who's in a hospital, Kelly LeBrock. And then there's a scene where he kicks the crap out of a bunch of guys in a garage. You know what I mean? And they saw the test, and they said, "This is great." And I said to them, I think you're making the wrong movie with this guy. And the producer almost went crazy because it was a go picture. I said,
Yeah.
I think you should do a movie based upon what he says his story is. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. He's a kid from Detroit who worked in a dojo, worked for the CIA. I said, we can do a movie based upon that would be much more interesting than the story about stealing televisions in San Francisco, right? And Terry Semel and Bob Daly said, how long will it take you to write the script? Because there was a strike coming. And it took 5 weeks. And I hired Ron Shusett, who had done Alien.
Yes, I saw that.
And Stephen Pressfield, who became a famous novelist later after that. And we wrote the script. Seagal got story credit, and that became Above the Law.
I think it would be fair to say you got Seagal at the perfect time. As I mean, there's an actor. I'm not digging, but there's an actor with stories around him over the years. But I mean, the pictures that you did with him was kind of the start and the peak of him. And I just wonder what there was between the two of you that locked in, really.
Well, when I met him, he had much more humility. He wasn't a
That's
star yet.
very tactful. Yeah,
And politically, it was at the height of Iran-Contra.
yeah,
And I
right,
was
okay.
very interested in the politics of that, very interested in it. And there was a dark story about a guy named Danny Casolaro, who was a journalist who was wound up being suicided in a hotel room in Virginia when he was investigating this octopus conspiracy. And there's a novel written called The Octopus. There's a whole thing about the man who's supposedly dead now, who I think killed him. Anyway, Seagal was in touch with some really strange characters in the CIA and who were involved with mafia stuff. Anyway, there was a political point of view about the corruption that was going on. As a matter of fact, I don't know if I take credit for it because I'm not proud of it, but I think that Putin saw Above the Law. There's a line in Above the Law where Seagal says, not one CIA agent has ever been tried, much less accused, blah, 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 blah. And you've killed entire populations and all this negativity about what the CIA done in Southeast Asia. So Putin becomes his buddy. He's a martial arts guy, and they become buddies. Now he's a governor in Russia. So politically we got along, and he was, I was able to he looked good, and I was able to work with him as an actor and as a martial artist, And so after that, a few movies later, Terry Semel said, "Get Davis again to do this movie Dreadnought," which became
Yeah,
Under. And Seagal, had gone off and worked with a guy named Peter McGregor Scott, a producer who wound up
yep,
becoming my new partner, who was fantastic. So Peter and I connected on Under Siege, and Tommy's in the movie. Tommy Lee Jones is in the movie a little more than Steven Seagal,
yeah.
more minutes, and that became the biggest hit of Warner's that fall. And it was that was the movie that the studio said to Copelson, get Harrison to see this movie, and so it was Under Siege that got me The Fugitive.
I'm going to come to that film just in a second. I do want to. The book I read just before yours was Barry Sonnenfeld's recent book on his stories of working with Hollywood, which is just delicious. It's just like,
I don't know Barry a lot, but every time I talked to him or been around him or heard stories from other people, he's fantastic.
I mean, it's the humility crossed with the candidness is just delicious. And, from the outside looking in, I mean, I've got behind me shelves full of old film magazines that are all gossipy and tell us all these stories and things like that. And from the outside looking in at your career, you work with actors who are, inverted commas, perceived to be difficult. And in the package, you had Gene Hackman and Tommy Lee Jones. And the reason I bring this into Barry Sonnenfeld's book is Barry talks of working with both of them and really kind of gets.
What did Barry do with Gene?
He did get Shorty,
Oh yeah.
and he basically talks in a very delicate way about the insecurities of actors, even the ones that we perceive to be absolutely rock solid and completely on their game. I mean, Gene Hackman and Tommy Lee Jones specific, you've got terrific work out of. What kind of relationship do you have with them? Do you recognize it from like the gossip columns, or are you a bit closer to what Barry's talking about?
Well, I wouldn't call those guys insecure.
Yeah,
Mean, maybe there's something deep down, but I don't think they're insecure. Matter of fact, they're very willing to tell you what they think and what they want to do, you know.
yeah,
Um, it was interesting because, I was a young director and, and working with Hackman, I had to learn to sort of back off and let him find his place in the scene and how he wanted to navigate certain things,
yeah,
because I'm a shooter, right?
yeah,
And it evolved to be great. There's a wonderful scene with he and Tommy on a plane, where they're talking about what their plans are, and these two lions together. Um, Gene was cutting lines. It was very interesting. So Gene was cutting lines from the script, and Tommy went to the producer, Arnie Schmidt, who had been an AD with me going back to the Corman days.
yeah.
Um, and he said, he's fucking with my kids. He's cutting my lines. He can't do that. And so there was a tension between them. At the end, the last day of shooting, when on the bridge, they didn't say goodbye to each other. That was very interesting. Um, Tommy and I connected because of a lot of things. I'd seen him in Backroads, a film that Marty directed. He played a boxer,
Yeah,
and I always thought he was very interesting talent,
yeah.
macho kind of tough guy. And when we met, it turns out that the quarterback for my high school was the quarterback at Harvard when he was on that team.
Right. Okay.
George Lalich. So that was a good connection, I felt. Anyway, so after the package, when we did Under Siege, it was, it just evolved into these three films.
Well, the third of those films being The Fugitive, of course, which is a film I appreciate you've been interviewed an awful lot about. So I'm not going to ask you about the train crash, if that's all right. I think you've answered that question a few times. I do think the thing that's forgotten about The Fugitive, though, is just how quickly it came together in the end. That I'm reading. So Under Siege comes out in 1992. I'm reading a press report from October 1992 saying you've been offered a Western by Fox. You've been offered versions of the Three Musketeers, and Warner Brothers is in quote serious negotiations about The Fugitive, and that's October 1992, and it's in cinema. It's on cinema screens. What 9 months after that? And just the turnaround of that film absolutely baffles me. And I just wonder if you can take me into the pace of it when you jumped aboard and just kind of the race to the finish line.
What's the line? This guy never stops. That's the line in the
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, you know, I had this incredible team that had just done Under Siege. Just
yeah,
my Chicago crew and Peter and Dennis Verkler now was the editor.
yeah,
And Dov Honig, who had worked on Stony Island, and Don Brochu also became part of the editing team. And so I got a call. I went to the premiere of Under Siege. I've told this story before, but and Arnold Kopelson came up. I know your next movie, and I didn't know Arnold really at all. I know he was involved in financing Platoon,
yeah,
and I said, okay, great, and that was it. And then I got a call Sunday night from Bruce Berman, the head of production at Warner's, congratulating me. I said, what happened? He said, Harrison saw Under Siege over the weekend in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He wants to meet with you and talk about The Fugitive uh, Monday or Tuesday.
yeah,
And they sent me the script, and I read the script, and it didn't make any sense at all. The Tommy Lee Jones character had hired the one-armed man because Harrison had done a bad job operating on Tommy's wife.
yeah. Oh,
I
right.
mean,
Okay. That's a,
and I don't know who was responsible. This had been through many hands, and a lot of people who I thought didn't do contribute things, who later found out they did contribute. But anyway, it had been in the hands of different directors and writers. And so I went to this meeting, and I met Harrison, and I met Arnold, and studio executives were there, and we talked about the movie, and Harrison basically signed off on well, we'll fix it, we'll fix it, right? And so I left the meeting, and I called my sister Jo, who's a nurse, and I said, "What would get doctor in a lot of trouble?" And she called me back a couple of days later. She met with a young resident who was an OBGYN, and he said, "What if there's a drug protocol and it's really bad news, this medicine they're trying to
Yeah.
test, and they're trying to cover it up?" And that became the basis of the plot of The Fugitive. So now we had a bad entity we had to build the story around, of his doctor being accused of murdering his wife. Why? Because he said this pharmaceutical was terrible, and the drug was called Provasic for
Yeah.
vascular, but the company is called Devil in McGregor. My
Yeah.
producer,
Spotted
Peter
that.
McGregor.
Yeah.
And actually, there are cups and things you can buy right now about with that on it.
But I mean, the timeline's correct then. You were making a
So
fundamental
so so
change
we
to the
made
story nine
right, and
months
I said
before it was out.
I said, so first of all, we had to get the script right,
Yeah.
which there was never a completed script that somebody could say, here's what we're going to do. We knew what the beats were going to be. We knew what the essence of it had to be. There was things cobbled from different drafts. The train crash, of course, was in there.
Yeah.
Um, and so uh, we went to work, and basically I said to Harrison, we need to go to Chicago. I think it takes, somebody I read that he takes credit for going to Chicago, which is, but he hadn't been to Chicago since he was in high school, I think. But anyway, um, but he is from Park Ridge, a suburb of Chicago, and I remember going to Jackson Hole and getting off a plane, and he met me. He says, "We're going to Chicago." So
Yeah.
that was great, and so that we just put everything in motion. And Peter, my guy named Mike Malone, who's a great location scout, and all the people from the film office worked with us, and they found a train track out in North Carolina that we could control.
Yeah.
And Peter figured out with Roy Arbogast how to make this train crash mechanically, engineering wise, work so we could shoot it and have it be real.
Yeah.
And then, and then we just went on and on. We built it. We had this dam. We built a thing on the dam down there. Everything else was shot in Chicago and Illinois, except for that one sequence.
So was there a point where you were choosing? I mean, were the tales of a Three Musketeers film at that point, or a Western at that point? Did you have, after the success of Under Siege, a slate of things that you could have picked? Or was it just like zeroed in on
Now
The
that you bring
Fugitive?
those up, I'm trying to remember what the Three Musketeers thing. I don't remember whose project that was and who
Yeah.
had the Western. I think there was an idea of redoing Gunsmoke or something like that.
Oh, okay.
I think that was on the table, but I don't remember any specific studios and offers and producers connected to those titles. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a garage full of old deal memos and boxes and scripts and things like that. I have to
Oh, send them to me. I can put them on my shelves
under my
behind.
brain what all the things we didn't do. But anyway, it was it was Warner Brothers number one, who I just worked with. I had a
Yeah.
relationship. They were very supportive, and Peter was there, and we had to fight a little bit to get Tommy in the movie, and they wanted Anthony Hopkins to play the part.
Good grief.
And I kept saying, no, 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 you got to have an American. You got to
Yeah.
have a real who can play this part. And he played it like a Texas Ranger.
Worked out that, didn't it? That garage full of stuff that you've got. Are you ever tempted to take like the Barry Sonnenfeld look and turn that approach and turn that into a memoir of your film work?
Oh my God, I have to be 120. There's so much stuff in there.
I'm buying it already. I want to
No,
read
no,
this.
no, no. I'm actually in the midst of giving a lot of it to the Academy has some of it, but giving
Yeah.
it to UCSB. But once you give it to the university, it's hard to get your hands on it
Yeah.
again. You know. But anyway, I'm very flattered that you've done all this research. My God, out in the hinterlands of Birmingham.
Well, quite glamorous Birmingham as well. But the other part of The Fugitive that I think is missed as well is the post-production seemed as quick as well. That yeah, I read that there's a team of about four editors that you've got to somehow keep on top
Six,
of.
six,
Six,
six
six.
editors.
Of course there
There
were.
were three main editors:
Yeah,
Dennis Lertler, Dov Honig and Don Brochu, and there were several other editors who helped us with stuff.
Yeah.
Um, Barry Reardon, who was the head of distribution at Warner Brothers, said, if I could have this thing for the end of August or August something, it could play into the fall, and
Yeah.
it was not it was a slot that was like the end of vacation time, and he said, this is the date we want to head towards. And Peter was an animal. He knew how to. He was a master of post production. He knew how to organize it in such a way. I was like a dentist going from room to room, working with different editors and different sequences, and our editors would trade off sequences with each other and come up with different ideas. And then James Newton Howard started working on the music while we were still shooting. We had done the package together,
Yeah.
and he nailed it right away. He pulled themes from the package and added some other stuff that I liked. And then we just we were literally looping and dubbing and timing the picture and going back and forth from laboratories to dubbing rooms, day and night. And then it came together, and we showed it to the studio, and they said, "Don't touch it. It's perfect." And we made 1,900 changes after that.
I mean, not a bad
Just to
film though,
trim up
right?
things and make
Yeah.
things a little bit.
I mean, but it sounds like the most basic of questions, but when did you know? When did you know what The Fugitive was, that it was going to turn into this thing?
Well, there were two parts to that. When James came to Chicago to listen and talk about the score, he
Yeah.
had done some temps and stuff. We watched some cut sequences in my hotel room, and I watched it and I said, this could appeal to grandmothers and grandchildren,
Yeah.
because you cared about Harrison, his terrible, tragic, Les Miserables, innocent man unjustly accused, and then you had this chase and this bulldog of a marshal who was after him, and I think there was both empathy and fear and caring.
Yeah.
And so I said, this could maybe resonate. First of all, the biggest star in the world at the time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And and then later when we had a screening for the sound crew, which were nominated later for an Academy Award,
Yeah.
we'll talk about effects and get a sense of what the job was going to involve for them with all these sound effects and things. Um, they really responded to the movie, and so that was several weeks before we finished the movie.
It's interesting. I'm hearing that I've heard it from a few filmmakers. The least valued person on a film, according to by studio executives, is the composer because it's the easiest thing to change if they don't like the film for whatever reason. But I remember talking to Phil Alden Robinson about Field of Dreams, and he said the moment he knew was when James Horner watched the film for the first time, and
Really.
he could just lock straight into it. It's really interesting you mentioned James Newton Howard in that kind of environment. That's interesting. In terms of what happened next, I mean, obviously they went and made a sequel without you, which I presume you were offered at least. The
No,
chance. Were you
oh, no, no,
not?
no. I was
Because that's
busy
two
doing
of your
had the
films.
same. No, I was already doing A Perfect Murder.
It's right. Okay. So that you delivered
Same
two hit
producer.
films and didn't get to.
Copelson tried to take. What happened was, um, I don't. Warner sent me the list of all the projects they had. I
Yeah.
said, what does Warner's have in their library? What's available? And I came across this remake of Dial M for Murder.
Yeah.
And I sort of was interested in it, and I called up Copelson, and he said, "Well, great, let's figure out how to do it." But he was already trying to make a sequel, I think. I don't know where they were at with it. I don't know where
Yeah.
that was at. But he was trying to take advantage of the fact that he couldn't get Harrison to be in the movie again, and he got Tommy and Wesley Snipes and Downey was in it, for God's sakes. So they were doing the Marshall movie while we were doing A Perfect Murder.
Can I talk about the film that's slotted in between there then? Because it's one that never made it to the UK, and I tried to watch this film and couldn't. I can't get it on
Steal Big,
streaming.
Steal Little.
Steal big, steal
No, go
little.
go to my website. You can
Well,
watch it
I'm
tomorrow.
coming exactly to that point that you've become an archivist of your own films that you can't get anywhere else. And so when I'm interviewing someone, I try and watch a film of theirs that I've not seen before or looked at for a while. And the problem was I went to your website in the end to get it, and I ended up getting Mentor instead and watching that. So I'm coming back to that shortly because I do just want to ask you about that. I thought it was a fascinating piece of work. But Steal Big, Steal Little, I just want to touch on it because I don't hear anyone talk about it, and I've never had the chance to see it, and I will seek it
You're gonna
out.
love it. You're gonna love it. We just had a screening in Santa Barbara
Yeah,
at
because you've
at this.
compared it to Stony Island just in terms of the narrative. That's why I'm particularly interested as well. Just in terms of it's
Well,
not got.
it's a film that's it's based on a documentary I did years ago,
Yeah,
a true story. But anyway, after The Fugitive, I was offered this incredible deal by a company called Savoy. It was a company that was started by the characters who had done TriStar.
they're the ones who offered Sylvester Stallone 60 million for 3 films around that time. Yeah,
So basically they said you can make any three films you want, and you have final cut, and you can own the negatives, and it was crazy, I think I don't know if they had a distribution deal. They were starting their own distribution company, I think.
yeah,
And it was a very outrageous, and they got money from the Pritzkers in Chicago, and they used my name to raise money.
right.
And and so I said, okay, great. I can make a film in Santa Barbara where I live now, and I can do a story based upon this wacky documentary I had done about a land fraud case in West Virginia. I'll adapt it to Santa Barbara. And so I had carte blanche. I think they had the Power 100 of Hollywood. I was in that list that year, because I had final cut and a put deal. It was very rare. And so I started putting together the making of this movie, and it was very hard. We had to sell off foreign rights, and because they were going to put up half the money, I think, and I had to sell the foreign rights for the other half. And it was quite a complicated process, but we wound up pulling it together. And I offered it to Andy Garcia, who loved it, and then we got Alan Arkin, and we showed the film. So when the film came out, they said, "Why is this guy who did The Fugitive trying to make this kind of comedy? What is he doing? Why does he
Yeah.
care about it?" And it basically, the company folded before the film even came out. They had done a film with De Niro,
Yeah.
and they were broke before the film even came out. So it was pretty depressing. But years later, um, we did Fox. What happened? It got sold to Fox. No, it got sold to Barry.
Barry Diller was
Who's
it at Fox?
Barry Diller.
Yeah.
Barry Diller bought Savoy. Now it's Universal has it for another year. Okay, and they just let it sit. But we showed the film recently, and people were blown away by
So
it.
do
I
you
mean,
own that now? Have you got the rights to it back?
I own the rights to it. The domestic rights are still with Universal for another year, and I don't know how to get it out to the world, but it's so timely because it deals with greed, it deals with immigration, it's about family and love and sharing. It's a very beautiful movie, and Frank Tidy shot it, and it's I'm very proud of it. So we showed it recently, and people couldn't believe it because they had seen it many years before and it didn't resonate. When they saw it today, it really resonated
Yeah.
with them emotionally and politically and stuff like that. So if you go to my website, you can download it, you can rent it.
It's $3. It's £3.99 for UK listeners, or $3.99 in America. And I will put the plug in. It's andrewdavisfilms.com, where I can also buy and rent Stony Island and also Mentors, Tony and Santi, which is your most recent movie. Again, I'm coming back to that really shortly. I just want to just
Okay.
touch on this just before. I'm gonna what? I'll give you my word. I'm gonna watch Still Big, Still Little. That's gonna be my
Okay.
Christmas
And
film,
you got
and
to
then I'm
call
gonna
me and talk about
and
it.
then I'm gonna come back to you on
And
it. I
finish the
hope I
book
like
too.
it now. Say again, sorry.
Finish the book and
Yes,
tell me
don't
what you
worry.
think of
Don't
that, and then
tell
watch
me.
the movie.
Don't tell me the ending of the book. You can't tell me the
Okay,
ending of the
we
book.
can have a separate conversation about the end of the book and Steal Big.
I'm looking forward to it already. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I just wonder, can we just quickly touch on Holes? Because I don't want to overlook that film at all. One of the things, there was an interview Tom Hanks gave a year or two ago where he talks about the missing ingredient with film is time. That everything is assessed absolutely in the moment at that point. Now, Holes enjoyed some success at the time, But also, when I'm telling people I'm talking to you, the fugitive obviously comes up, but I keep hearing again holes, holes, and holes. Time and time again. And I dug into this a little bit, and I found a really old interview where it said you were up against Rob Reiner and the Coen brothers for the rights even to
Well,
make the film.
now I'm not sure. Louis Sacker told me
Yeah,
that at the time we were looking at the project,
yeah,
but we wanted to get the rights. I don't know if they're their agents or their producers or they themselves specifically were interested because it was something it was a very it was an award-winning children's book, a Newbery
of course.
Award, National Book Award. And so they're saying, what's out there with, there are people working for these people all the time or themselves, you know, uh, who's the great actress who's married to the Coen brothers?
It's not Frances McDormand, is it?
Frances McDormand was
Yeah.
interested in playing the warden, I think. Tim, Tim Blake,
Really?
Tim Blake Nelson told me that later. The part that Sigourney got, she was interested in that part. Anyway, so we just called him up, and Lewis agreed to give it to us because of The Fugitive. He thought I'd keep it real and gritty and not keep it a kind of a kid movie.
That's interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't necessarily put those two films side by side, but it was a case of one got you the other that earned you the trust.
Yeah, well, he felt that there was a certain tension and
Of
darkness and
course.
reality, which is in all my films, pretty much in some way. But yeah, so Holes is beloved around the world. I mean,
Yes.
if I meet someone who's in their 30s and they find out I did Holes, they go, "Wow, that's the film I grew up on." And it's a book that keeps getting taught in school and it
Yeah.
keeps living on and on and on. And it's playing around the world all the time, either by people playing the DVD or downloading it or, calling up from the Disney Channel.
That must be quite satisfying from where you're sat. I mean, that's people talking about your work decades on. I mean, you've had anniversary screens of The Fugitive, you've had anniversary screens of Stony, and of course, there's Holes in the midst as well.
And they just showed the package at the Chicago Film
Is
Festival.
that right?
There's a
You are the
package related.
Chicago Film Festival, aren't you? All of your, they could just program your films top to
Yeah,
bottom.
yeah. Anyway, listen, it's really great because I haven't directed a feature film for a studio in a long time, and mostly because I don't want to do something that is meaningless to me, and
Yeah,
I'm not offered the kind of stuff that these $200 billion visual effects movies. So the idea of having your films playing around the world all the time. And I
yeah,
get the reports from the Directors Guild, how Yugoslavia, Poland, Russia, these are films that are being downloaded and
yeah.
rented and seen on television in one form or another all the time.
I mean, the last big inverted commas movie you did was The Guardian. I enjoyed The Guardian, but I went through the end credits of that and I thought, I can see why you did that. The number of things, because there's a special thanks bit at the end of credits, and the amount of, I mean, the tribute you play to like the real life heroes in the end credits of that film, and it's just like I always felt the draw to that was honoring that to a large degree.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, it was very moving to work with those men. And they're in the movie. There's
Yes.
a lot of the coast. We were going to start The Guardian when Katrina hit, the huge hurricane in Louisiana. And we had a tank and a boat and got smushed around by the storm. And we had to move from New Orleans to Shreveport. And the guys who were helping us prepare the movie had to leave to go save people. They literally had to jump in helicopters to go
Agree.
pull people off the roofs. And to go up to Kodiak, Alaska, and see what it's like to pull somebody out of the Bering Sea in the middle of a storm, it's pretty powerful. And so, because of The Guardian, they had huge recruitment afterwards for Coast
Yeah.
Guard swimmers, and they got the money to build a new swimming tank in Fort Elizabeth, down where they train in North Carolina. So that was a great gift.
I'm coming back to your book for the very last question, but just before I head there, I'm coming back to Mentors, which I hadn't expected to talk to you about at all. But then I've watched it today, and now I'm just like, I just want to ask you just one or two things about that. First of all, can you just quickly explain what it is to because I didn't really know the stories of the people involved with it and why you had the thirst to do it?
Well, I'm a photographer, and I had a mentor,
Yeah,
several mentors. So when I met Santi Vasali at a party, and there's these pictures of Frank Sinatra and Sophia Loren on the wall, these people he took. And I had read an article about a guy named Tony Vaccaro, who had talked about how he had been working in Patton's army and he was a soldier, but he was processing photographs at night in the helmets of his buddies, and he found all these old negatives were stored away for years, and he'd become a famous fashion photographer and worked for Life and Look. And I said to Santi, you ever heard of a guy named Tony Vaccaro? And he stepped back. He says, I wouldn't be here without Tony Vaccaro. And I knew immediately that this relationship between these two legendary photographers who had covered both history and culture and fashion was going to be an amazing story because I had the best images already. I had their work, the
yeah.
life work of these two brilliant historical photographers. So now, what was the story about how they met? And that became the documentary.
I mean, there's some brilliant tomato cutting in the film. I should note that the precision of the tomato cut. But there's just a moment really early on where one turns to the other and says, "I was getting the bombs that he was dropping." It's just like the fragility of how that relationship between those two came together, and just one little whisker of fate, and they never would have met. And
Right.
I mean, the knowledge bombs they're just dropping in. I was writing them down by the end. In photography, you have to be there at the right time, and they spend a chunk of the you know this, of course. People at that level, they know how to relate to the camera. They know they need a good picture. And just a little anecdote. I'm trying to tease it for people who haven't seen it without spoiling. A little Rockefeller anecdote that just seems to come out of nowhere. So the reason I'm bringing these up is you've got so many little nuggets that they just drop in almost casually into the conversation between these two people. But I also read you were developing it as a pilot as well, that you want to that there was an intent somewhere to tell
Well,
more of
after
their
we finished it,
story.
we said, after we finished it, how can we turn this idea of mentorship into a series? And it hasn't happened. I wanted to get to Obama or something like that, to
Yeah,
basically say, let's take stories of whether it's a 12-year-old helping a 7-year-old as a mentor or
love that.
music. What was the scope and scale of what a series about mentorship? How could it be done? And I just have been too busy to really pursue that. It's a full-time job. I'd have to find a great producer who could figure out how to get it off the ground.
Oh, I hope you do. I think I thought that genuinely, I just thought that documentary was really something, really special and really human. And I don't begrudge you the £3.99 that I spent
Yeah,
on it
yeah.
today at
You know
all.
what? People can watch if they go on. There's a documentary called "The Making of Stony Island" with Quincy Jones and Chuck D. It's on
Right.
my and look at that. So 35 minutes long. And so how we made Stony Island. You can watch that and then watch the movie. But it was very touching because Quincy is on. He just died,
Yeah, of
and
course.
he says some really great things in there.
So, I mean, just to round off, before I completely outstay my welcome, also on your really comprehensive website, I've had a lot of fun just going through this. You talk in development of two things. Number one is the film version of Disturbing the Bones that you've talked about. The other is Treasure Island: The Search for Silver's Gold. And you say you're a busy man, but by the sounds of it, you might have more Disturbing the Bones. Not bad for someone who's never made a sequel, to my knowledge. And you've got this other project on the go as well. So what's filling your days? What's the drive for the next story?
Well, I'm just we've done having to do publicity on a novel is incredible. It's insane. You're on your own. You've got to sort of get the attention to your book.
Yeah,
There are hardly even book reviews written anymore.
no,
Kids don't read books. So how do you get people to buy your book or read your book or know your book? So the goal is to finish the screenplay that we started years ago, rewrite the screenplay to adapt from the novel, and then try to get that movie made. It's going to require 3 big actors and a studio. So that's one project.
yeah,
Treasure Island, we're still trying to get off the ground. It's a very much like Holes. It's a good family movie, and
Yep.
I've like, got to find a leading man who's big enough to get that financed. There's actually a third project. There's a novel that was written by Gene Wilder called My French Whore. We're going to call My French Amour, which is a World War One story, a sort of Peter Sellers spoof, an anti-war
Oh, wow.
movie, and that's something I'm developing with a friend, Alexis Nolent, who's a graphic novelist from Paris, and so those are the three main projects that we're working on right now.
And to bring it back to Disturbing the Bones, again, as someone who's not made, not necessarily by choice, a sequel to your stuff before, it sounds like from interviews you've given before, you've got a real kinship and interest in pursuing these characters more. Are you looking to expand that universe, even if the film doesn't get made, into more books?
Well, I there's some finances involved in it. I don't know that I want to spend another 2 or 3 years writing another novel without
Yeah,
any money up front or getting paid or not knowing what's going to happen. I mean, I love working with Jeff Biggers. He's
yeah,
terrific. We would probably work on something together, but we'll see what happens with the book. And if the movie gets off the ground, then of course we'd make. Now, Michael Mann, who gave us a great blurb for the book, is doing a movie about Heat. So
of course.
he's a sequel on his own movie, So.
Well, you've had £3.99 off me today, Andrew Davis, and I hope that that goes in the pot to get this movie going.
Great. Well, I'm very flattered that you've done all this work and looking into the stuff. I feel, exposed at this point, and
Not at all.
let me make sure I have all your contact information. Okay.
That would be great. And I want to go through your garage while you're not looking at your massive archive of things. Andrew
Okay.
Davis, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Take care.